Morning, everyone. Thank you all for your attendance today. Today we'll be going over the Learning and Growing webinar, writing effective test questions. Sorry. My name is Sidra Dastier. Our presenter today is going to be Dave Baskin of Delta College. I'm a member of the marketing team here at Hawkins Learning. We will have a live Q&A session after the presentation today. So if you can hold any questions that you have towards the end, that would be great. And right now I'm going to hand it over to our presenter to get us started.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, my name is Dr. Dave Baskind. I am from Delta College in Michigan. And today we're going to be talking a bit about writing good test questions. And just a little background on me. I've been teaching for more than 25 years at Delta College, and I've been teaching more than 30 years overall. And part of the reason why I'm really interested in this topic is that I've actually written some test banks for different publishers over the years. And as you will hear me say along the way, test banks are great. They are a wonderful resource for you, but I would encourage you to not exclusively rely on them. I'll say more about that in a bit, but I have written a few of them. And as Sidra mentioned, if you do have questions for me at some point along the way, you can either put them in the Q&A or you can hold on until the end. And I'm looking forward to having a little bit of dialogue with you folks. So that said, I'm going to dive in here. And hopefully you're able to see my PowerPoint on the screen. If not, please let us know. So first, I wanted to talk about a few things to consider when writing effective test questions. And so I always feel like the place to begin is by asking yourself, what do you really want the students to know? What are the things you want them to walk away from this material with a good understanding of? And so you should start by trying to focus on the big issues throughout the course material or throughout those chapters. I've seen too many instructors get bogged down by focusing on a tiny little detail that's maybe mentioned in a side box along the way, or asking students, in this piece of research, what year was it conducted, or who was the third researcher on that? And these tiny little details aren't necessarily important. I will say something more about that in a second, though. So along those lines, when you're asking students questions, especially with a number, when you say things like what percent of Americans believe whatever, I would encourage you to not have choices that are really, really close together, like 42%, 43%, 44%, 45%, because those kinds of little details may not be that important. I know when I ask numbers questions on my tests, the numbers are usually a bit further apart. So saying things like, is it closer to 10%, 30%, 50%, 70%? That to me seems a little bit more fair. The one exception here is that unless those details really matter. So if, for example, there's a precise measurement that students need to know in your welding class or in your automotive class or in your chemistry class, then it's okay to ask about those tiny little details and very specific kinds of numbers. I would say you should also consider asking yourself whether you want students to memorize the information, memorize the terminology, or if you would prefer to have students apply their knowledge. Now, in a psychology class, for me, I think it's great if students have a good understanding of definitions of terminology. It's an important consideration. But for me personally, I'd much prefer that students can apply their information. So for example, rather than asking students what the definition of negative reinforcement is, I would prefer to have a question asking students which of the following people is demonstrating or utilizing negative reinforcement. I might still ask both questions, but I prefer the applied questions when given the opportunity to have those. Another consideration is how you arrange the material on the test. And for some instructors, they group the material by chapter, by section, by content. And that's my preference also. I think it helps students to stay organized mentally. And I do think it makes it a little bit easier when you decide to switch up or replace some questions. Think a little bit about that also. If you are using a test bank, do you want it to just randomize the questions, or would you prefer that the items stay within their basic chapters or in that basic area of the test. I think it's a consideration. Another thought is to avoid too many questions on the same topic. So, let's say we have chapter 10 that we're covering and it's 30 pages, and to potentially focus, half of your questions all on 1 page worth of material or 2 pages is not really doing justice to the full content that you want students to understand. And as you can see there, I say that's a problem with test banks. So, when I have been tasked with writing test banks, oftentimes the publishers will say, hey, we need you to write 60 or 70 or 100 questions for this particular chapter. And in order to accomplish that, I might have a whole lot of questions regarding the same basic concept. If you're picking a random selection of 50 questions from that chapter, it's possible you may get a whole lot that are about the exact same topic. You may have 7 questions about negative reinforcement rather than the questions being more widely distributed across all of that chapter's content. So if you do have a random selection of test items from a test bank, just take a look at it. Be sure that they're covering the topics that you feel are valuable, rather than just focusing on a very narrow part of the material. Okay, so that said, I wanted to dive in and start talking a bit about the different types of items that you might include on your tests. And the first type I want to talk about are true-false items. And as you can see there next to my asterisks, I would really encourage you to avoid them. These are my least favorite types of questions, and there's a few reasons for that. For starters, students have a 50-50 chance of getting it correct. And those are pretty high odds, even if they don't really know the material. It's a little dangerous in that sense. It's also dangerous in the sense that one simple word can change everything within the sentence. So you can see I've got a few examples of true-false items up on the screen, and I want to talk about issues with each one of them. So let's say we ask students, true-false, people have 2 arms. Well, in general, that is true. Most people do, but not everyone does. And students might have a problem with you saying, well, that's a true item because, yeah, typically people do have 2 arms. True, but not everyone does. So in that sense, false is probably the better answer. The next example there, the 2016 Olympics were in Rio de Janeiro. Well, that seems pretty accurate, and for the most part it is, but Janeiro was misspelled there. They weren't in Rio de Janeiro. It was Janeiro. Is that a big deal? I don't think so. I would say that's basically a true item, but a student could argue that it's false because that's not the right spelling. The next one, Frankfurt is the capital of the state of Kentucky. Well, yeah, Frankfurt is the capital of Kentucky, but you could also argue that officially, technically, Kentucky is labeled as a commonwealth. And so a student might say false to that on that basis. Next one, the birth name of the current president is Emmanuel. Well, that's not the correct birth name of the current US president. However, it is the correct name at birth of the current president of France, Emmanuel Macron. So if you said that is a false item, I might argue with you. I would say that's a true item. It just isn't specifying the president of what. So you got to be really, really careful if you choose to write true false items. Again, my preference is to not use those. And if you choose to, avoid words like always or never, because all it takes is one instance otherwise to prove the whole thing to be incorrect. So to say that people have 2 hemispheres in their brain, well, that's true for almost everyone, but there are some people who have had something called a hemispherectomy, where they had half of their brain removed. So saying that everyone has 2 hemispheres is not accurate. So watch out on those always and never items. We'll go next to the fill in the blank items. And the first thing I want to point out there is that you've got to watch out for spelling issues. If the test is being auto-graded, which I know a lot of instructors opt for, the student may type in an answer and it may be counted as wrong because it was misspelled, even if the students know the information. Pay attention to that. Likewise, is it okay if the students just list the last name? So I'm a big fan of Jeopardy, and this is also one of the things that maybe inspired my interest in questions and answers. And Ken Jennings wrote a book quite a few years ago. He's arguably the greatest Jeopardy champion ever. He won, I think, 73, 74 games. And he tells a story of how, I believe it was on his first night on the show, there was a question, and he wrote down, "Who is Jones?" And the answer wound up being correct. The answer was Marion Jones, a great Olympic athlete. The way he wrote the book, though, it's not really clear if he was just taking a guess, like putting down a last name that's fairly common, or if he actually knew that the answer was Marion Jones. So are you comfortable with students just giving the last name? If you say, this politician, um, let's see, I'm trying to think here. Well, you could, Kennedy's. There's been a bunch of politicians with the last name Kennedy. If a student writes the answer Kennedy, is that good enough? Or do you want them to specify John, Robert, Ted? If you want it more specific, be sure to ask for both a first and a last name. Be sure also that the questions are airtight. So this example is fairly airtight. In other words, it says blank served as the Attorney General of the United States from 1993 to 2001. There's only one answer that really works there, and that's Janet Reno. And again, would it be okay if the student just wrote Janet or if the student just wrote Reno? You can make that determination. So that question is airtight because there is only one accurate answer there. If you flip it around though, Janet Reno is a famous blank. I would argue that's not very airtight. There's a lot of answers that should be considered correct, starting with person. Janet Reno is a famous person. But maybe you wanted something more specific. You could say she's a famous lawyer, a famous politician, a famous Harvard graduate, a famous Floridian, a famous member of Clinton's cabinet, and so on and so on. So just consider how tight that window is for possible answers. Likewise, with fill in the blank items, consider how long that answer space is. If you make it short, does that indicate that it's a very short answer, like the word car or Reno? If it's a longer space, does that indicate that it's a longer answer that's expected? I would probably advocate for you keeping all the lengths the same so that it doesn't tip it off in terms of it being a longer or shorter answer. Either way, though, you should give that some consideration with the fill in the blank items. Then we get to essays. So essay items are incredibly popular because they give students an opportunity to explain themselves. And oftentimes you want students to have more thoughtful answers and to demonstrate that they have a deeper understanding of the content. So you want to be really, really specific in your instructions to students. So if you say, tell why the Civil War began, and the student says, well, there were two parts of the United States that were disagreeing. Well, I'd say that's a correct answer. It's not wrong, but that may not have been as specific as what you were hoping they would provide. So if you want longer answers, be sure to give them some indication there. So saying, give at least 3 reasons why the Civil War started. That might provide students with, well, at least they're going to have to say 3 things now. Name 3 politicians who contributed to the start of the Civil War and discuss the role that they played. I like this one a bit better because now they have to name names and they have to tell what kind of role those individuals had in terms of the beginning of the Civil War. I'll get to it on the next page, actually, I think. Consider whether wrong information is going to cost students points. So I've seen students write really good essay answers, but then they wrote some incorrect information also. You should think a little bit about that in terms of your grading. Are you going to hold that against them if they have some information that's incorrect, even if the rest of it was accurate? Just give it some thought. That's what I was looking for, the third point there. Is it okay to list? So for example, you could just say, name 3 politicians who contributed to the start of the Civil War. And by saying it that way, name 3 politicians, at least in my eyes, to get full credit, all the students would have to do is name 3 people. But if you would prefer more of an explanation, and by the way, I usually do, then be sure to include that. So I might say, name and describe the four lobes of the cerebral cortex, or name the four lobes of the cerebral cortex and be sure to tell what each of the four does. By doing that, now I'm ensuring that students have to provide more information. And you could even include something there about the scoring. You could say, 1 point for each accurate lobe that's named, and 4 points for accurately telling what each lobe does. And that kind of information will also guide you a bit when you start grading. Also helps the students know why maybe they didn't get full credit. When possible, especially with essays, I like giving a little bit of flexibility. Now, with multiple choice, true, false, matching items, things like that, those are usually lower stakes. They tend to be worth a smaller number of points. Essays typically are going to be worth a bit more points, and they get students a little bit more nervous, I think, because they are more valuable in terms of how they're scored. So when possible, I like giving students options by saying, pick 2 out of these 3 essays to answer, or 6 out of the 8, or 8 out of the 10, but be sure you pick at least 1 per chapter. If you can allow for flexibility, I would say do so, because again, it does reduce some anxiety. The one exception there is that maybe they need to know all this information. It may be especially important that they can tell all about this and that and this, and you want to hold them responsible. If so, be sure to tell them, hey, you've got to answer all of these. And one other thing I would mention in terms of the options there, be sure to put that in big, bold letters, spell that out, maybe even state it when you hand out the test, put it in clear lettering on the exam, because a lot of times students do get a bit rattled or forgetful, and they might just answer 1 out of 3 instead of 2 out of 3, and all of a sudden they've lost some points. Now, maybe they only answered 1 because they don't know the answers to the other 2. Okay, that's a different issue. But sometimes they just plain forget. Likewise, sometimes students will answer all 3 items, all 3 essays, even though you said pick 2 out of 3. I would encourage you, consider in advance what your policy is going to be there. For me personally, I always, if I say pick 2 out of 3, I always just look at the first 2. So make a little, got to make a decision there at some point. And again, you want to give very specific instructions on what you are looking for. Tell students maybe that your answer should be at least 3 pages long, or that they need to include different types of information. The more specific you can be, the more guidance you can provide students with, and the more likely they are to give you the kinds of answers that you're looking for. Now, they may or may not know the information, but at least you want to guide them so they know what your expectations are. So I believe the next thing I have here, let me talk a little bit about a special note to those of you who teach math or science courses. Consider whether only the answer matters, or if students can get some credit for showing how they properly set up the equations. If you want them to show their work, be sure to state that. If you're okay with them just saying, hey, the answer is 42, that's fine. I'll tell you, this is my personal preference, and I say this not being a math or a science instructor, but having taken a lot of math and science courses in my past. I know psychology is a science, by the way, and that's what I teach. But my preference is that students should get some credit for setting things up properly, even if they miscalculated along the way. So if you can give them some credit for at least showing that they know what to do, even if they didn't get the right answer in the end, personally, that would be my preference. So I think what is next is multiple choice. I'm just going to click there. Yep. And I'm going to go back for a second. I didn't put anything up here about matching items. I don't know if I have any really strong advice or suggestions for you about matching items. But I know that a lot of instructors do like using those. But maybe this is a good point, though, for me to take a little pause here. We can maybe do like 5 minutes or so. If any of you do have questions and you want to put them in the Q&A, and I know that Sidra is keeping an eye on that. So any questions about what I've said? Anything unclear? Anything you want to disagree with me on? I like a good debate.
Let's give them a minute to kind of populate their thoughts. We
That's what
don't
I'm
have
doing.
anything yet. All right, we have a question. With COVID, there's been more online testing. It's difficult or costly to students to monitor these effectively. Would you please discuss online exams with particular reference to time per item, approved resources such as books and notes, and types of items, especially with regard to multiple choice?
Absolutely. Whoever wrote that question is psychic because that's going to be coming up in just a couple of slides. So if you hang tight, I will absolutely be addressing that.
We have another question. How do you estimate the time it will take to include essay questions in a generally multiple choice exam?
That's really difficult. I don't know if I have a great answer to that. In part because it depends on the nature of the essay. How long is it? How involved is it? How many pages is it? Um, I I really don't know. But even once you get beyond some of those considerations, obviously every student is a bit different in terms of how long they take to actually come up with the ideas and to write it. And some students are a lot more careful than others. They want to write it, go back and check again, revise it, and so on and so on. Others will just type it out or they'll write it out and then, yep, I'm done. So um, I really feel for whoever was asking that question because I absolutely have the same concern. I think one of the best ways I can maybe answer that is that experience is a good teacher. And excuse me, after you've been teaching for a little bit and giving similar types of exams, you might see a pattern in terms of the amount of time required.
There's a little bit of a
Little frog in
clarification.
my throat here.
No worries. There's a little bit of a clarification to that question. So I think they're referencing specifically time for students to answer these, less of an essay and more of a paragraph, like a hybrid between short answer and an essay.
Mm. Yeah, so a question like I mentioned earlier, saying what are the four lobes of the cerebral cortex and what does each of them do? The listing part typically is going to be much quicker, and that's kind of more like a fill in the blank sort of thing. But how much writing do you expect them to do with that? If the student lists one or two functions of that lobe, is that good enough? Or do you expect a bit more explanation and writing there? Again, it's a really tough thing to gauge.
There's another question that I could probably answer. Will
Oh,
there be a recording available for this session? Yes, there will be. We'll be sending out the link once it becomes available. And with that, I think you can go ahead and
oh,
continue.
terrific. Okay, thank you. And feel free to keep questions coming in the Q&A. Okay, so multiple choice. My hunch is that these are probably the most popular types of items that we use. That's my guess. They are very easy in terms of scoring. They can be computer graded very readily, very accurately also. And it gives the students a chance to show that they know things, even if they can't free recall the information off the top of their head. So I'm going to spend the biggest chunk of time here talking about multiple choice items, but I will be coming back to the question about online testing and amount of time allowed. So the first thing there, it's a silly little minor consideration, but it is a consideration that when you put the answers there, you want to be sure to consider whether it's a or an. So if you're asking people about an apple, if you say my favorite type of fruit is an, well, obviously it's going to start with a vowel. If you put a, it's going to start with a consonant. If you don't want to tip students off in terms of which way the answer is going to go, a lot of instructors will put the letter A with the N in parentheses. And that way it doesn't really specify if it's A or an. So that's a minor detail. I think the other things are more important to consider. So the next point there is to keep answer length similar. So each of the times where I've been tasked with writing a test bank for a publisher, what they told me is that when in doubt, students will usually gravitate towards the longest of the answer choices. So if answer A is this long, B is this long, C is this long, and D is that long, more often than not, the longest answer will be the correct one. Now, that's what publishers have told me. I don't have any data to back it up, but it has been something I've been very conscientious of ever since then. So when I design a test, answers A, B, C, and D, or if there's an E, I try to keep them about the same length in terms of the number of letters or characters. To go back to something I said earlier with true-false items, watch out on those where it almost seems like a gotcha kind of question. When you say things like all or none of the above, students will sometimes get a little more nervous. And I'll tell you why here. All of the two, all of the above is better, because what that means is that to be accurate, A, B, C, D, perhaps they all have to be accurate. But if students know that A and C are correct and they're not sure about B, well, still, if there's two correct answers, chances are D is going to be the right answer there with all of the above. But none of the above is a really difficult one, because it says to students, it could be this, could be that, could be this, or it could be anything else. And I know that when I first was teaching, I was a TA, and the instructor gave the first test of the semester. And the average score on this first test was 40%. That's not a good test score from the students. It was all multiple choice. And the correct answer on 60% of the items was D, none of the above. It was a really rough test. And so ever since then, I've really tried to avoid those none of the above alternatives. I just think it's too broad. It opens too many other possibilities. Try to ensure that it's going to be one of the choices that's listed there, if possible. All of the above, like I said, it's a little bit better, but I try not to do too many of those. Do you want the answer choices to give it away? So let's say we're asking students, which of the following is a primary color, red, brown, gray, or white? I don't think it's that difficult of an item, but most students would probably know that it's red. Nonetheless, they are going to have to maybe think for a moment, what are the primary colors? Then again, if you said, which of the following is a primary color, red, house, run, or into? Well, only one of them is a color. You've kind of given away what the right answer is going to be there. And what's really interesting to me is that you can easily change the difficulty of a test question item based on the choices that you give students. Yes, the body of the question is important in determining the challenge, the difficulty level, but I think a lot of the difficulty level has to do with the choices that are presented there, and this is kind of an example of that. Okay, do you want to have 4 options or 5 options? I don't have a strong preference there. I would say 2 options is too few. It's, 50-50 shot again. I've seen some instructors use 3 choices, A, B, C. Personally, I tend to prefer 4 or 5 options. Most of the time, 4. Either way is okay. But I would really caution you against having too many more choices than that. And I've heard of instructors where they had choice A, B, C, D, and then choice E is A and B, choice F is A and C, choice G is A and D, choice H is A, B, and C, and so on. And it just gets really confusing and overwhelming. I would say try to keep it to 4 or 5 options. And Scantron sheets, NCS sheets usually are going to accommodate that better than if you have a different number. Okay, here's a controversial item. Should you include humor? For me personally, I like doing this. I'll make pop culture references. Sometimes choice E is obviously a wrong answer that I just included to not to distract students, but to maybe make them chuckle or smile a bit. I like being able to look out at my students and see a couple of them maybe giggling a little bit Or after the test, they'll say, oh, that was kind of funny how you had that there. Generally, my experience has been that students appreciate a little bit of humor, helps them to relax, reduce the stress level, because keep in mind, test taking is very stressful for students. That said, I have seen some research indicating that use of humor is more of a distraction to students. Um, so it's something to consider. I like it, I prefer it. My students have said more positive things about it, but it's possible it may not be the way to go for everyone. Try not to use the same letter too many times in a row. And this is especially true on an NCS or a Scantron test, because if students have to fill in C, 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 they're going to start doubting whether they're actually giving the correct answer. So mix up the letters a little bit. I would say this is less of an issue on a test where maybe online, where each page is a new item and they might not notice that, oh, they picked C a lot of times in a row, or where they have to circle the answer on the test. They might not notice it. But on an NCS or Scantron sheet, they are going to notice that. So try to avoid having the same letter be the correct answer too many times in a row. Will earlier items give away the answers? So let's say that item number 1 on the test says President Obama's Vice President, Joe Biden, once said the following. And then you've got the next few items. And then item number 8 says, which of the following men was a vice president in the past 2 decades? And they go back to test item number 1 and they're like, oh yeah, Biden, that's right, he was a vice president. Now that said, it's not necessarily a bad thing to do. And sometimes students appreciate that, oh, I wasn't sure of the answer, but then that earlier one helped me to figure out the correct choice. More often though, students won't even notice that you actually gave it away in an earlier answer. So you don't have to worry too much about this one, but it is something to think about as you are designing a test. And again, some of these issues are especially important when you're using test banks, because test banks may choose items where they've given away the answer in a previous item. And likewise, if you let the choices be randomized, so maybe on my version of the test, the choices are A, B, C, D, but someone else randomizes it and my choice B was your choice A, and so on, the computer, just luck of the draw, might have 6 answers in a row where the answer was always D. Again, think a little bit about that as you're designing your test and choosing which items to utilize. Other issues. So for starters, what is a bad question? Let me tell you what I think does not qualify as a bad question. A bad question is not necessarily a tough question. I'm okay with tough questions. I will look at the data from my test items, and if I see an item where maybe only 1/3 of the students got it correct, I would say, yes, that's a tough item. But I will look back over it. How was that item worded? Was that material that was actually covered, either in their readings or in class discussion? A tough item is not necessarily a bad item. That said, though, sometimes I will look at the answers and I'll see, oh man, a lot of students struggled with it. Oh, here's why, I misworded something. Or maybe it was something that wasn't covered. Point being here, think a little bit about how you want students to address it when they have a problem with the item. My preference with in-class tests is that they talk to me about it at the time. So if they see item number 5 and the wording is a little funky, or both B and C seem to be correct answers, I can take a look, I can address it. Sometimes I'll say, hey, everyone, there's a problem with item number 5. Here's what it should say. And I can clear that up right then and there. But with online tests, they don't necessarily have that option. So what do you want students to do? I've heard of some instructors saying that if you have a problem with a test item, you've got to put it right there on the test. You've got to write that somewhere that, hey, item number 5 was confusing. Others want the students to discuss it when they hand it in, or to talk about it later that day, or to email them, or whatever your policy is, just give it a little bit of thought of how you want students to address bad items. My one preference, though, is that you probably want to deal with it sooner rather than later. If it can be handled right then and there while they are taking the test, especially in person, I think that's usually the best. So I always tell students, hey, if there's a problem with an item, talk to me. We definitely want to be more sensitive to diversity. And when you are designing a test, especially with a lot of different scenarios, as I mentioned earlier, I like giving applied questions. I like that students have to not just memorize stuff, but they can apply their knowledge to different real world kinds of situations. And when you're designing tests like that, be sure to include a variety of names so they don't all sound male or they don't all sound typically Caucasian. When you're having scenarios and you're talking about couples, you want there to be some diversity there. So you can talk about gay and lesbian couples as well as heterosexual couples. You want to be sure that the material is going to be stuff that hopefully all students are familiar with. So if you have an item in which you're talking about a popular singer that you loved in the 1970s, like John Denver, students might not have any understanding of who John Denver was. I don't even know why I chose John Denver, by the way. So you may want to take a look at the current charts, and maybe if you're going to mention a singer, maybe mention someone that's a little bit more contemporary that students might be more familiar with. Maybe Justin Bieber or Kendrick Lamar, for example. Okay. So earlier, someone was asking me about the timing of tests, and admittedly, this is a really difficult item. So what do you think? When students are in class, do they have to finish it in that time frame? They might have to. There might be another class coming into that classroom as soon as yours ends. And so they might have to leave. Are you okay with them finishing up their test, maybe in your office or in a nearby classroom? If students are going to take the test in the testing center, do you have a specified amount of time or can they take as long as they wish? But I think the biggest issue with timing is one that was posed as a question to me a little bit ago with online testing. And I'm really torn on this one, I'll be honest with you. So here's the challenge. If you make it a non-timed or an untimed test in an online environment, potentially that gives students more opportunity to talk to people, to look things up, and you may not be comfortable with that. So I'm nervous about making it an untimed test. Then again, if it is timed, students may feel a lot more pressure. They may feel rushed. They're seeing that clock counting down in the corner, and they're feeling the pressure of that. What's the best way to handle it? I honestly don't know. But I would say, think a bit about it. You may even want to ask some of your colleagues what they do. Students are almost always going to say they want a non-timed test, but are you comfortable giving them as much time as they wish to complete the exam? I don't really know. It's a tough issue, so it's something to think about. Online testing also has real concerns about integrity. You know, will students be cheating? Will they be looking stuff up online or on their phone? I would start with this. Whatever your policy is, first of all, give it a good bit of thought and be really clear. Let students know in advance that, hey, when you are taking the test, here are the rules, policies, and expectations. Put it in your syllabus, mention it to them when you give them reminders about that upcoming test. So that's the first time. You want to let them know in advance. Second, if you can include it right at the beginning of the test, those reminders, even if it's a separate page saying, hey, on this test, here's what you are and are not allowed to do, that's great. One other thing I do is on the first test of the semester with online testing, the first item is, again, a reminder about my policies. So it will say, it's a true-false item. It is okay for students to use their notes and the book, but they are not allowed to look up anything online or to talk with others about the exam, true or false. And I can give them a whopping 1 point for knowing the answer to that. But it serves as a little prompt, as a little reminder for them. I know that some professors like using the lockdown browser. I don't personally have very much experience with that, so I don't have any great advice on that front. But it absolutely is a real big challenge when students are taking tests online. How do we know for sure that they are not cheating? How do we know for sure it's even that student who's taking it? It's challenging. So my preference, if possible, is that students take their tests in the testing center or in person. But, obviously over the past 2 years, we've all taught a lot of classes online. That's not possible. We hope students are demonstrating integrity, but, there's definitely no way to know for sure 100%. Okay, makeup tests and retake policies. So the reality is that some students will be unable to take the test during that time frame or on that particular day. Now, for some students, they may just forget. They forgot, oh, I was supposed to take that test today. And for others, they weren't able to. They couldn't get transportation that day. They were in the hospital. They had COVID, you name it. There's a million reasons why students may not have taken your exam. Okay. Now, I have seen some instructors basically say, if you don't take that test, then you're going to get a 0. That's it. Personally, I'm not a real big fan of that policy. It does not speak to the realities of the world, especially with COVID. Do you want students coming to class with COVID because you've told them they have to take the test on that day? Personally, I don't. I don't want them putting me, their classmates, and even themselves in harm's way. It's not worth it. So you've got to have some kind of game plan. And my advice is to let students know what that game plan is in advance. So is there a penalty for taking a test late? You may want to include one. You may not. The student may have had a legit reason. They couldn't be there on campus. Campus wouldn't allow them to because they tested positive for COVID. Is it fair to penalize them? You can make that determination. But let's put it this way. If you do choose to penalize them for taking the test late, some students will do everything they can to get there on that date, even if they are not healthy and well. That's a risk for you and the rest of the class. How late can they take it? Are you okay with them taking it a week late, a month late? Just finish it by the end of the semester? I don't know. Give that some thought. So if the student isn't there on test day, then what happens? Do they get to take the same test as their classmates? I'm always a little bit nervous about that because there's the possibility that that student may have talked with someone else in the class about what was on the exam. Even if that doesn't happen, they now have additional time to prepare for that test that their classmates didn't get. So I'm always a little bit nervous about letting students take the exact same test as their classmates without penalty. So what do? Well, you've got options. One of them is that you can create an alternate exam or an all essay exam without penalty. Sometimes I'll even give students the choice. I'll say you can take the same test as your classmates, but since you're taking it a day late, there's going to be a 10% penalty built in because you've got more time to prepare than they did. That's one option. Or you can take the all essay makeup exam. There's no penalty for taking that, but it tends to be a bit more difficult because essay items tend to be more challenging. But I'll actually put that decision in the student's hands sometimes. Either way, give it a little bit of thought. What happens when they can't be there on test day? Likewise, can they retake an exam? Personally, I'm not a real big fan of this because that means I'm now going to potentially have to grade twice as many exams. Quite frankly, I don't know if I want to do that, but I have heard of some instructors allowing students to do that for an exam. Again, whatever it is, be sure to think a bit about your policy and be clear with students about it. Because if you allow this student to retake their exam, the rest of the students should probably have the same opportunity. And just before I skip over it there, I wanted to mention that at least my policy is that with low stakes kinds of things like a small quiz worth 10 or 20 points, students can take the same quiz as their classmates, but they do lose like 2 points or 4 points for taking it late. Small penalty for doing that. But with tests, I'm not totally comfortable with this student getting additional time and getting the same test that they could have talked with others about. So again, give it a little consideration. Okay, so that was basically all I had prepared for today. A couple of things. So first, I will open this back up again to questions or controversies or issues that you might have or thoughts or disagreements on any of this. But if you do want to continue the dialogue with me personally, if you do have any questions or concerns, feel free, you can email me anytime and I'd be happy to talk further about these issues. But until then, let me open it back up again. I can see that some people have put stuff in the Q&A and the chat, and I will rely on Sidra. What kinds of questions or issues do people have?
So speaking back to your multiple choice section, someone wrote that in multiple choice, speak to the notion of two correct answers, but
Mm.
one is better than the other.
Ooh, that's challenging. And let me start with this. I like including that instruction at the beginning saying which of the following is the best answer. Okay. Because now you've said potentially there could be more than one that could work, but one is better than the other. That said, so that kind of covers it, I feel like, on my end. Like if I didn't write a perfect question, it still says pick the better answer. That said, I'm a little bit nervous about doing that, of having two answers, but then saying this one might be better than the other. Um, so I would say, if possible, have there only be one right answer rather than two right answers, but one that's good and one's really good, because students might disagree with you about which one is better than the other. That's just my opinion on that one.
I agree as well. Speaking to your diversity section, someone wrote that they used their new student list and changed the exam question names to reflect the diversity of students at their location, which has a large population of international students.
Oh, that's
And then
great.
they added the most popular names from their birth year across from the globe for areas that were not represented.
That's really good. I like both of those ideas. I especially like the one about including some of your students' names. I've done that in some of my classes also. I think that's really wise. And sometimes students are like, "Hey, I noticed that you mentioned me and her and him, and somehow we wound up on the test." They might actually enjoy it. But if you're going to do that, just be sure to, you don't want to say something like, Jan just failed her test. Which of the following now? And then Jan is taking the test going, oh my gosh, he singled me out. And now it might fluster them a little bit. But if they're more kind of neutral items, I like that idea of including students, either current ones or former. And I like that idea of looking at some of the world's most popular names to include on tests. Either way, it's good to be culturally sensitive to the diversity that's out there.
Speaking to the time component, whether or not exams are timed, there's a little bit of controversy with that. With one person wrote, my students complained bitterly about being timed, but when I gave them
Right.
too much time, the cheating was unbelievable. I
Right.
have years of data on how students do on my tests, so cheating was easy to recognize. It would have been even if I didn't have the data.
Yeah, I feel for the professors. I feel for the students. I'm actually here in my daughter's room. She is studying abroad, but she is currently a college student. And she has told me she hates it when there are time tests because she feels so much pressure and she feels like it's really tough to answer all the questions in that time frame. So I feel that. Then again, I feel for the professor who is chiming in here, because I have the same concern. If it's an untimed test, the possibility of cheating just keeps going up incrementally. So I don't know what a great solution is other than, if it's possible for them to take the test in person, whether it's in class or in a testing center, that's my preference. But the reality is that so many students are taking online classes, and obviously so many have needed to over the past couple of years as a result of COVID. So that's, out of everything I've talked about today, that's probably the thing I personally struggle with the most.
All right, I think that's it for all the questions, and that's it for all the time that we have. Thank you, Dr. Baskind, for all of your knowledge, and thank you all for attending today. If any of you, of your fellow instructors are interested in presenting for our Learning and Growing webinar series, please submit your proposals to the Learning and Growing website, which I'm going to go ahead and link right here in the chat. And we will be emailing you a link to view the recording of today's webinar once it becomes available. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. This was great information. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining me, and thanks for your help.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close out the recording. Thank
Terrific.
you so much. It's a pleasure working with you.
You too. Thank you for all your help today. Nice meeting you. Bye
Nice
to
to
everyone
meet
who's still here and watching.
you.